Is China building super soldiers?
Well, I think probably yes. I think they probably are. Take a step back. When I start to put together the pieces and I see, a global collection of DNA information, and I see contracts that say population improvement, and when I know that the competition, and at the same time I see massive investments in genetic engineering and biotechnology, I think it's pretty likely that they're developing some form of human improvement. Again, adding up all these pieces, very, very possible, and I would say likely that sort of quote-unquote super soldiers are being made.
Tower, Delaware 6 is release to you, runway 4 left, wind 040 at 5, clear for takeoff.
Seat tied, altimeter 0 eyes, we're clear for takeoff, clear for the airspace. Viper check 2. My burn ramp curve at 354. So yeah, flights on. Next picture 16, 15,000, I'll give you some of that. Viper on target.
Sir, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Excited for this conversation. As we joked before we hit record here, I'm probably going to be terrified by the time we walk away from it, but it'll be interesting to glean your experience, your expertise, and just learn a little bit more about AI, the future of espionage, and everything in between.
Thanks so much for having me, and it will be my pleasure to terrify you and the listeners today.
Yeah, that's great. Well, first, kick it off with a bio. So Dr. Anthony Vinci, you were the first Chief Technology Officer of the NGA, that's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which I think that was one of the three-letter agencies that for quite a long time weren't even acknowledged, but doing a lot of good work over there. You have served in Iraq, Africa, and Asia, and you have a new book out, The Fourth Intelligence Revolution, The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America, which, again, I kind of joke, it's terrifying and exciting all at the same time. So again, thanks for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I would like to actually kind of kick it off just a little bit about like your background and maybe how you found like your way into the NGA, your expertise, the interest. What was your path to that point just to start with?
Yeah, like a lot of guys of my generation, I was on a path and then 9/11 happened. And I decided that I wanted to get into the game and serve the country, and was pretty upset with Al Qaeda at that time, and so I became an intelligence officer, and I specifically trained for and became a case officer, which is somebody who kind of spots and assesses recruits and handles sources. So go out in the field and find people who have information, placement and access, and then recruit them and convince them to commit treason on their own country and pass me information. Then I did that for a while, deployed to Iraq and went to some other places. And then I left government, and I hadn't necessarily wanted to be a lifelong government employee. I kind of wanted to get out there, serve, do the mission, and then move on with life. And I did, and I founded and ran a tech company after that. And I was, again, kind of on that path and running this tech company, exited it, and got invited to be on the board of NGA. And the director at the time, Robert Cardillo, whom I'm still friends with and consider a mentor of mine, he was looking for somebody who knew intelligence and had been in the tech industry and knew where tech was going, especially data and analytics and AI. And I, right place, right time. I was the guy, and came in and put together a whole strategy for that agency. And I sort of imagined the future of NGA, where they're doing satellite imagery analysis and geospatial analysis. And then he and the deputy director, Sue Gordon, essentially called my bluff and said, "Why don't you come in here and implement?" And I did. So I ended up in government again.
Interesting perspective. You and I obviously have both been in government. From my perception of, as I look at the last decade or so, obviously big focus on technology, implementing technology, speeding up the acquisition process, being adaptive to the changing game that's happening at an exponential rate. Because we've seen, I'm sure you can relate, make an assumption here, government, obviously there's usually a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, and things don't move that fast. However, when we're talking about the technology today, specifically AI, having to move at, an incredible pace for the government, for the incredible pace for just society in general, let alone the government. Did you see that transformation? Do you think we're moving in the right direction when it comes, for the government to adapt and accept new technologies and acquire these technologies?
I think that the government sort of set up the perfect system for acquiring things for a Cold War, right? If you want to buy and build aircraft carriers, if you want to make the best fighter jet in the world once every 10 to 20 years, if you want to kind of prepare and continuously build rockets and missiles and manufacture ammunition for a major war that might never happen, we had the perfect system. And then what's kind of happened is that, competition, warfare, and technology have all changed since then. And, I think you're getting at this, and it's exactly right, which is that technology now moves so quickly, you can't make anything that just updates every 10 or 20 years. Like, it just doesn't work. And you especially in terms of software and artificial intelligence. And now, by the way, all the hardware is driven by software and artificial intelligence too. So it's even the hardware is moving that quickly. So we need this new system that is able to kind of keep up with that pace in competition with an adversary in China that's starting to move at that pace or faster, right? And that's what's changed. I'm a little bit optimistic. I'm seeing some changes now in the Department of War. I'm seeing guys like Steve Feinberg, an old boss of mine. I used to work at Cerberus Capital, who is and Pete Hegseth, the secretary, who are really moving the acquisition system forward. But it's going to take some time to see if that actually works.
That's great. I never thought of the analogy of the Cold War system developed, because I've made this comment. People obviously, and I'm not the only one. We talk about like the F-47, this is going to be the newest, latest, greatest, next generation air dominance fighter. Do you build this plane, which traditionally, takes us decades to bring online and make IOC, and now you bring it online a decade plus from now, or even 5 years from now? Is it solving the problem that you designed it for today? Because we don't even know what that emerging threat is. And then I look at too, like we said, I fly into China fairly frequently. And just if I try to compare apples to apples, which again, I don't know the inner workings, but like Guangzhou, very large airport. Most of the airports put ours to shame when it comes to design. And maybe, behind the skin, it doesn't look that great, but I don't know, I probably doubt that. They just recently built in a whole additional terminal and additional runway in a matter of 6 months. And I joke, like the Atlanta airport, I think they're on year 3 of building a parking garage. Now, again, maybe that doesn't extrapolate across to the defense and tech space, but I don't know. It seems like they're able to iterate and to develop things very quickly. So if they're able to do that, are we getting outpaced? Are we being outmatched when it comes to this? What do you think?
It's nice to be the newcomer in some ways, right? They don't have baggage, right? There's not an old airport typically that, like think JFK or Dulles or something that is, been there for decades and that you have to work around all these issues to update something. Same thing goes for their technology in the military, right? They essentially, it's not that they started from scratch. They obviously had a military, before 15 years ago, but it was so small, it was irrelevant. They could really just sort of build a new system and have autonomous weapons from the get-go, for example. And I really saw this, and I write a lot about this in the book, like in intelligence, where they didn't have all the baggage that we had, the bureaucratic baggage, the systems. As you know, when you update anything in the military or in the intelligence community, it's not just that one thing, it's everything else that has to update, right? You can't just like plug and play some AI SaaS software and fix the problem. There's 50 other systems, some of which have been there for decades, that you have to update alongside of it. And that's hard. And so the only hope I have is that they're going to go through the same thing as we are at some point. They're going to have this baggage now. And unlike our system, their system's very hierarchical, it's very authoritarian in every way. And what happens when you do that is you can make the wrong decisions. And you can go down a pathway that doesn't work, whereas our system tends to be much more decentralized. Even in the military, it's more decentralized. And so we may be able to kind of catch up and ultimately surpass them through this more, for lack of a better word, like kind of capitalist leaning system.
Yeah, you always say your enemy is 10 foot tall and bulletproof, or you plan for that, but that's usually not the case. And then I do agree with you, because anecdotally, I've seen that from a decentralization of decision making. That does not exist in most aspects there. I mean, even like I've seen very small tasks or decisions that are required to be made, but they get elevated to such a level, it takes 15, 30 minutes, and 10 people are involved in a decision that really would just be one person. And again, not always the case, but I do think that decentralized execution, and specifically coming from my world, hey, here's the intent. Go out and execute your tactics, implement whatever you need to do in order to meet that intent, versus kind of micromanaging every little decision. So maybe that is, an advantage when it comes to it. So it's very interesting to see it all play out for sure.
Especially in warfare, right? Where the more decentralized, the better often. And that was my background too, as a case officer. You're out there on your own. Maybe you have an interpreter with you, maybe you have some security, but basically, when I would go outside the wire in Iraq, it was just me. Like there's no one directing, and that's in a tactical situation. That's sort of what you need, and it's yet to be proven that China could ever operate that way. That they have that culture to do that. I sort of doubt that they do.
On that thread, like the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. And when it comes to AI and machine learning, part of that being able to obviously see what's going on, observe it, make a decision, and act upon it. Seems like that circle is going to get smaller and smaller, tighter and tighter, that rat race. So when then it comes to making a decision, if it requires multiple tiers of approval to make a decision, that it's going to be next to impossible to win. If you're relying upon commanders who are removed from the battle space, be fed information, and then pass that decision down, like it's just not going to work out. How do you see that? Do you see that evolving? Do you see that changing when it comes specifically talking about OODA loop?
Yeah, I think the OODA loop is just a great way to look at the world. I'm a huge John Boyd fan, and I think that what is likely to happen there is, I agree, you're going to be disconnected from anyone because maybe it's a comms denied environment. Maybe there's just no way to communicate, right? And things are going to start happening so quickly in warfare because of autonomy, where, imagine, you've probably seen these videos. I've seen them where they have these drone formations in China. They use them for like entertainment now. Yes. It'll make like an image. I saw one where they were playing Tetris like on drones. It's incredible, with thousands and thousands of these drones. Now imagine that, where you've just got thousands of, active entities, and moving very quickly because they're machines. And the OODA loop to react to that is going to have to speed up so much. I think what's going to happen ultimately is that the human's going to kind of get cut out of the loop largely. And that the only way to keep up will be to have your own kind of AI-driven system at the edge that's reacting on its own, that's observing, that's orienting, that's deciding, acting all on its own at machine speed. And we sort of already see this in one place, which is in finance, where you've got these hedge funds. They're called quant funds, like quantitative funds, where they're trading like literally at a microsecond speed with all this complex data coming in. There's no possible way a person could keep up with it. So they just let these machines go. They just trade on their own against other machines operating that fast. And that's the only way to do it. I think the same thing's going to happen in warfare, where that OODA loop becomes like literally seconds to even microseconds in length.
This go down so many rabbit holes. So what does warfare become? What does the battle space look like if all of a sudden, you can't survive on the battlefield as a human being because there's drone swarms everywhere or whatever it might be? What does this look like?
Yeah. I think it looks like science fiction is what it looks like. And warfare is kind of like that sometimes, And one way I think about it is, imagine Ukraine, what we're seeing in Ukraine, but times 100. And I take this idea from Steve Winchell, actually, who's the director of DARPA now, who's a friend. And imagine Ukraine times 100, where there's 100x the number of drones moving at 100x the speed, right? With what does that environment look like? Well, it looks like there's just a lot of actual machines on the battlefield, and maybe drones are closer to what we think of as ammunition today, right? And where that's the mass. I think it's where the intelligence, the operations kind of converge, where these things are a sensor and they're the shooter at the same time. Where maybe one drone is sensing what's going on and it's passing information to another drone, and then that, dropping the missile or is the missile, right? Like just rams into something and explodes. I think that there will still be people on this battlefield. There's a flexibility in what people do that, machines just aren't there yet. But it is going to be a kind of scary place. I would not want to be a United States Marine on a beach in the South China Sea when the balloon goes up. Like this is going to be a very, very dangerous place. I would not want to be a fighter pilot anywhere within range of anything, of any missiles, anything that can fly out of China. But the one more point that. It's not just going to stop there. It's going to kind of spread out. It's going to be about how do you, where's the magazine? How do you reload these systems? How do you move it? You're going to need autonomous vehicles to even get. It's going to be so dangerous. Can you even have a ship with new munitions piloted by a person to get to the island to reload? No, probably not. You're going to need an autonomous ship to get there, to move the things there. And then how are you going to make enough of these kind of drone or other types of, equipment to reload the magazine, right? So you're going to have probably you're going to have a lot of manufacturing, but maybe even autonomous manufacturing using robots to kind of go. So this form of warfare is going to be, driven largely by robots and AI. I call it in the book Singularity War. And then I think that's where we're going.
This part might not be applicable when I frame this question. So I've heard the examples of like the AI race when it comes to being on an exponential curve. Once you reach a certain point, obviously it's the rocket ship and it's straight up. Whoever gets to that point first, it's game over. Checkmate, they win because their AI can do whatever it wants. So when we talk about this and drones, you're saying sensors and the strike vehicle. So if they're doing kinematic effects, if they're sensing out there, but in theory, if I get AI to a certain point, that then it can see the entire picture before we can even see the entire picture. Now I'm envisioning, if I turn off the power, if I create chaos in your society, like this is a moot point. I don't even have to have kinematic effects because my AI has woven itself throughout everything that's connected in your society's world and just hit, the zero button. Like it's like the ultimate thing. Like, is that great? Am I even like close to something that could possibly happen like that?
Well, I'd bring up two thoughts on it. One is, I think you're getting at this is that the battlefield isn't going to stop at the drone war. It's going to go all the way into our societies, right? And you could go all the way back to like Clausewitz talking about warfare a couple hundred years ago. And really what it comes down to is getting, it's a war against the will of the people. How long are you going to fight for? And one way to do that is to just sort of battle them into submission, to the point, essentially what happened in Japan in World War II or Germany in World War I, where society just can't do it anymore. They just can't continue to produce soldiers and equipment and stick together. But there's another way, which is, you could convince them not to do it. You can influence them, and you can have these information operations against society to get them to stop fighting. And you can win that way. And I think AI is going to be used to do that. It's not just going to be propaganda anymore. Like the old days, it's going to be AI propaganda. So that's one thing about it. The other thing is, you're right when you describe the curve, right? Like there is this point where the AI gets so smart, where it's AGI, they call it, or super intelligence. That's really hard to comprehend. It's unclear when it will happen. It could be years, it could be decades. It's unclear, could it just be only one, group makes it? I don't know. Maybe China and the US make it at a similar time. Like AI is kind of like an academic exercise, like the information is shared. So we might both end up with something. And even then, it's still going to exist in servers and there's going to be a physical instantiation, which you could, in theory, fight against, right? You could bomb a server farm. You could use a cyber attack. So it might just become part of the war. It's sort of again, like at this point, we're talking about future war, and it reads like a science fiction novel.
Yeah, it's terrifying. But again, it's happening at such an exponential rate, and technology always injects change when it comes to warfare. It just seems like this time around, it's a little bit different. I mean, one of the analogies that I kind of relate to in my mind was, I do remember specifically, like my parents, my mom, who in the early 2000s, like, is it safe to put my credit card online to buy this item, right? And now everyone's walking around, with a smartphone, and their entire life is on it, and that is just normal now. Like how fast that mentality changed, and how fast the technology changed to enable that. I mean, draw parallels. Like I can absolutely see this thing changing very quickly. Just AI in the last couple of years, how much has become commonplace and utilized. It's changed drastically in the commercial space.
Well, it's something similar is going on, and I saw it when I was at NGA, which was there was this, and continues to be in some spaces, a distrust of AI. When I was at NGA, what I was trying to do was, what an imagery analyst does is they come into work every day and they look at images from satellites or from drones or from other sensors, and they're looking for something. Maybe they're looking for a missile or a new type of aircraft or a tank formation, right? Well, we wanted to use AI to do that, to look for to spot something, to identify what it was, to see, detect any change, right? There's a lot of distrust of the AI and its ability to do that, and kind of rightfully so. These systems can make mistakes. They were still new technologies back then, and kind of today still are. But I'm starting to see, just like with your mother, like it's starting to shift. And we are starting to trust this stuff more and more, even if we don't think about it, right? People do get in autonomous cars, and you trust your life to this thing, right? Like there's no more trust than being, taking your hands off the steering wheel in a car on a highway. And I think that sooner than we think, we're just going to put all of our trust, as much trust as say we have for a person, behind some of these things, including in the national security space.
Well, for the military applications, as you've written about, like the X-62, the Vista F-16, really, I guess what it is, right? Doing the AI dogfight. So that was really, the Air Force made a big push, I guess was that 2 years ago. And then as around the 2020, 2021 timeframe, doing a bunch of simulators, and they actually published fighter pilots in the simulator fighting AI. So, I mean, to me, that's like the ultimate trust. There was a pilot in that jet who obviously could override it, but you got two jets out there merging at 1,000 knots with AI controlling one of them. I mean, to me, that is mind-boggling thinking about the technology required to make that happen.
You know, it's interesting in that program, the ACE program that DARPA did. They were studying, the ability for the F-16 to dogfight, in real life. But they were also studying the pilots because they still, like you said, they had a pilot in the F-16 being flown by the AI, and they were studying like the stress hormone release and those kinds of things in this pilot to see how, we would deal with being, driven around at 1,000 knots, like you say, by an AI. I can't even imagine what that guy was feeling. like I'm still a little nervous in like a Tesla, and
right. not where not where I want to be. So hats off to the guy who did it. And I think actually the Secretary of the Air Force took a flight in that as well. Dr. Tyndall took their 4 last, which again, the chief, the head civilian of the Air Force flying around in an AI driven F-16. That is a lot of trust.
That is a lot of trust. It's one thing coming from a pilot who gets in a plane every day. It's another thing coming from, a guy who sits behind a desk every day. I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, hard pass. So going down this road, kind of jumping into the espionage piece of it, and I guess the segue I'd like to make is we develop all these systems. Let's say we get fighter jets that are controlled by AI, or maybe the segue there is a manned fighter jet, because I think this is really the current path that's being touted. You have an F-22 or an F-35, and it's flanked by drone wingmen, the CCAs, the Combat Collaborative Aircraft. But how worried do we need to be, or when it comes to those systems being hacked and being manipulated and controlled by an adversary with a 0-day bug or whatever it might be? Is that a threat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime you have any form of computer system at all, it can be hacked. And I have no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, and the Ministry of State Security, all of the national security bodies in China are trying to do that every day to figure out how to break into these systems. They're likely doing that for things that don't have AI in them either, right? You could just turn off a hydraulic system on an aircraft and crash it. You don't need AI to do that. You just freeze up some of the any system really and crash it. So, hopefully we've got secure systems in place. But it's going to get harder to defend against these things because AI is also going to be used for cyber warfare as well, right? And so you're going to have AI systems attacking the AI systems or the computer systems in general. And Anthropic just released a study not too long ago where they showed how China had used Claude, their chat system, to automate a cyber espionage attack. And they think that they automated 80 to 90% of this cyber attack. And that's, I bet that was just an experiment by China. Imagine this at scale, where you've just got automated AI cyber hacking going on. They're going to go after every system from a fighter jet to classified systems to our, telecom systems and so forth. And it's going to be very hard to stop. And I think the only way to stop it, again, will be to have our own automated AI, cyber defense systems in place.
The Claude piece is pretty interesting. I actually put that in my newsletter that came out because when I was reading it, these systems now, right, have all these safeguards. If you're an end user and you're trying to get it to do something and it's like, oh, that's against my, user guidelines, it stops you. It sounds like the Chinese kind of put a white hat hacker mentality on to say, no, I'm testing my systems, and that's how they were able to get around. But again, I could envision that when now you actually have developed a system that can be used in an offensive manner and doesn't have these safeguards, or they can remove these safeguards and weaponize it. Again, it's such a big problem set that how do you stop it? And on that thread, I had Joe Wise on the podcast. He's an industrial control systems engineer. This is about a year and a half ago. His big focus has been on industrial control systems. And he's been banging the war drum for 20 years. And he's like, it's not sexy. It's not ransomware and things like that. These are just the meters and voltages and flow rates and pumps and whatever facility, around hundreds of thousands, millions of them, right? There's probably 20,000 that touch between me and you today that we don't think about. And they were designed without the thought of someone having a malicious intent, let alone a supercomputer or super intelligence that can go out there and find these vulnerabilities and shut down a hydraulic pump or overpressurize this system and just completely shut down an entire, electrical grid for a region, which is terrifying when you think about it, at least for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's another area where I think, if there ever was a war, people on the home front would suffer, because there will be those sorts of attacks that will go after industrial control systems, SCADA systems, telecom systems, GPS, everything. And that will lead to immediate casualties, right? Just because, the equipment in a hospital isn't working, right? And people are in the middle of surgery. Ambulances aren't going to work. Like, this is really scary to think about. And I think a lot of people sort of envision war as something that happens overseas, right? And then there's the home front, and we've got these two oceans surrounding our nation. But I don't think it's going to be like that. And it's going to come from cyber attacks. It's also, by the way, going to come from physical attacks. Like if you saw the Operation Spiderweb, where the Ukraine military, it's an amazing operation. I wish I thought of it myself. Infiltrated drones into Russia, deep into Russia, 3,000 miles into Russia. They went all the way into Siberia, infiltrated these drones, and then simultaneously launched them to attack military facilities remotely, right? Imagine that happening here. And there's the war occurs over Taiwan or something else, and these drones just start blowing things up. Maybe military bases, but maybe civilian facilities. That's really scary to think about. And we've always, maybe we pictured that there might be a nuclear war, I guess, in the past, and we've dealt with terrorists before. But, nuclear war always seemed very distant, and terrorists seemed kind of random and small scale. I mean, this could be like real war with actual bombs being dropped in America, and it doesn't require bombers to fly over the nation.
It is terrifying. And you've mentioned that maybe it's not necessarily military bases, but if we look at where, it's open source and it's in the news, countries buying land around military bases. And then you see what Ukraine did. I mean, again, that was an impressive operation. So it's not too far-fetched that it can happen to us. And, if you don't want to fight a Raptor, I don't know, just take out the fuel tanks, overpressurize the fuel tanks, and then, maybe they can launch to the next base, but they can't get very far. Again, a lot of different ways you can skin the cat there, and it's all absolutely terrifying. Game's changing for sure.
Yeah, it's also, another operation, another one that, as a former professional intelligence officer, I wish I thought of is the, Israelis, Mossad, their intelligence agency, did an operation where they implanted explosives into, radios and other communications equipment of Hezbollah, and simultaneously exploded these things and killed some Hezbollah troops, but also, essentially degraded overnight their comms network completely. It's just gone. And imagine that with like a China, where, by the way, we buy, almost everything we use on a day-to-day basis at some point comes from China at this point. Just in civilian life and even in the military. I think people don't want to admit that, but huge parts of the supply chain come from China. And maybe they put explosives in it, or maybe they just make it so that it just doesn't function. And so in the time of war, they just turn it off. And that's really scary to think about.
In the Israeli operation, I mean, that involved probably multiple front companies, but then getting the licensing rights to make that pager and make it, the communication devices. So just talk about an intricate plan. So, not too far-fetched that just really bad things can happen, unimaginable things that you wouldn't have thought of in a million years of how this goes down. How do you see AI and espionage in particular, broad brush, and then maybe we can dive into a couple specific examples?
Well, the first thing is that I think that espionage will be done by AI. We talk about how AI is going to take people's jobs, right? Or it's going to do what consultants do. It's going to do what even like psychologists do. It's going to do what lawyers do, teachers do. Same thing's going to happen in intelligence. You can use AI to do the entire intelligence cycle. It can help you collect information. It help you analyze it, disseminate it, come up with the plans for collection and so forth. And it could even be used to recruit assets, right? To recruit people to commit espionage. And I think that's not a bad thing. I think that's actually necessary to keep up in today's world with all of this data, with things moving so quickly. We're going to have to use AI at every point in the intelligence cycle. And what intelligence officers do is going to change radically. And it's going to become a very, very different type of job where you're sort of now managing AI. You're partnering with the AI in a sense, rather than just always doing the job yourself.
So when you say the intelligence officer's role is going to change, do you still see human being a key piece of this and recruiting sources, or is that going to eventually go to the way of yesteryear?
I think there will, everybody who talks about AI always talks about how, well, like it's going to take your job, but like my job's safe. So I think, so it's easy for me to say, that the human officer is always going to have a job. I do think, human has always been sort of the int of last resort, right? It's when you can't collect information in any other way, you can't use a satellite, you can't use SIGINT, you can't use, ELINT or something like this. The only way into the room is to recruit somebody to go into that room. That's been the role of human for a long time now. And I think it still will be that, right? Maybe they just have a disconnected system. Maybe it is AI that we're up against. Maybe they just have a very secure classified approach. The only way into these, to get this kind of intelligence is going to be to find a person who has that placement and access and get them to go get the information for you. Maybe, for example, you want to recruit the guy making the AI. We were talking before about, okay, well, what if the we're in the knee of the curve and their AI is getting really, really good? How do you stop that? Well, maybe I can go and recruit their best AI scientists and get them to sabotage the system or give me information about it. So you're always going to have a human officer for those kinds of things, but these guys, case officers, the job's going to change radically. You're going to be dealing, we call it in the industry, ubiquitous technical surveillance. There's just cameras and data collection everywhere. And the only way you're going to be able to deal with that is using AI yourself to spot patterns and otherwise help you exist in that and operate in that environment.
You said, disconnected. I think like air gap system and like Stuxnet would probably be an example of an air gap system where we required a human to connect the dots there. But could you just air gap most of this stuff?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was what some of the reporting was, right? On it. They, somebody went in and took a thumb drive, a USB drive, from what I understand, and put it in a computer inside a cave somewhere. And the only way you're going to do that is with a case officer, with an ops officer. We saw it again in the Israel strikes on Iran, right? And they had, again, from my understanding of the reporting, Mossad recruited people inside Iran who emplaced autonomous weapons. So they had these autonomous machine guns and missiles and so forth, and they recruited people who then put them outside of a military base, and so when the attack happened, they could remotely activate these weapon systems. So it's like a really interesting example of what human plus AI and autonomous warfare really looks like. And again, imagine that times 100 if we go up against China.
So when it talks about actually putting someone, hey, we want to recruit the engineer or the person who's developing this technology. I mean, if you get in at the ground floor, win. Obviously, knowing the right spot to do that, that's part of the game. It does seem like China, though, they obviously have a lot of bodies and they throw a lot of bodies at a lot of problems, and we've seen it. I mean, it seems like every week someone's being caught for espionage, whether it's corporate espionage, it's military, it's intelligence. They've been planted. I only have one experience in my time of like actually an overt collection attempt where we witnessed it happening. But it's occurring. I mean, every single day, all around the clock. How do we prevent this? It seems like with our society is relatively open. It's a beauty, and also it's a big threat at the same time.
Yeah, this to me is the most radical change in how an espionage works today from the past. And what's happening is that, just like that battlefield's expanding, this competition with China in particular is expanding into economic areas, science and technology areas, and so forth. And that's all national security now. And collection now is being targeted at everyone. Because maybe you work in the tech industry and so you have information about this technology that they're interested in. Maybe you're a voter and they want to disrupt an election or influence what you think about a particular issue. Maybe you're just the parent of someone and are you raising them to, say, sign on to the military? We're all sort of this soft underbelly of the American national security system now that they're targeting. And they're targeting it for collection. That's why we see, every day on the news, some healthcare information's been stolen, some financial information's been stolen, but we're also seeing information operations against people. This is what's going on with TikTok. It's not just about taking your data on TikTok. It's influencing what an entire Generation Z thinks. And what they think about China in particular. So the only way I believe that you can defend against this is, we can partially rely, of course, on intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies to help. But that's not enough. They can't be everywhere all at once. I think you need to make the population resilient. And we've sort of done this for cybersecurity, right? We're all sort of taught to change our passwords and ignore phishing emails and all of these kinds of things. I think we need to do the same thing for espionage and for information operations, where we're teaching people, hey, here's the threat. Here's what you can do to kind of protect yourself and protect your family. And that really is the only way that we're going to be able to kind of, slow down, if not kind of halt this kind of, ubiquitous collection and operations against the American people.
All right. So when we're talking about governments, we're talking about massive organizations, whatever it might be, it's often difficult to have maybe a cohesive common vector. Hey, we're moving in this direction particularly, but having that that big overarching game plan that's 10, 15, 20 years down the road. It seems like that is a challenge to do. But do you think the Chinese are doing that? And then when it comes to manipulating society with TikTok and social media to sway opinions and how they see fit to be favorable for their objectives, are they able to do that, to have that long range plan and then implement it at the tactical level, if you will, when it comes to manipulating populations?
Yeah. Well, I would think about it like this, just sort of taking a step back. China's already implemented society-wide, surveillance in China, right? They collect everything on the internet that goes through phones, sensors on phones, cameras all over their cities. It's the most surveilled society in the world. And they're using that not just to collect, but to ultimately to protect the party, the CCP. They're doing this specifically through something they call this social credit system, where they can reward or punish people based on what they're doing. So if they see you, reading the wrong website or even like jaywalking, they can punish you. They can make it so you can't travel, right? And that all moves towards a system of social control. That's pretty well established. Like that's happening, and it's happening to 1.4 billion people. And now just sort of thinking like an intelligence officer for a minute, because obviously they're not going to tell us exactly what they're trying to do. But when I look at what's happening in America, I see an instance, not just in America, but kind of globally, where they're trying to expand that system globally and collect as much information as they can about us. That's why we see all these hacks. That's why we see them buying data. That's why we see them trying to put their technology in our telecom systems, like Huawei, for example, which is basically an open door to collect all of our information that goes through those networks. And they're doing that everywhere. They're doing it in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and so forth. Now, it's not just for collection. They, again, just like in China, they want to use it for influence, for control. Now, they can't directly punish us the way they can in China, but they can definitely influence people. And TikTok is an example of how they're doing that. And there are studies. There's a group out of Rutgers that has shown that, they do these statistical studies on TikTok versus other social media sites, where they show that not only is TikTok censoring information like about Tiananmen or the Uyghurs, which is a repressed ethnic group in China, but they're influencing people's views in such a way is that they've shown that the longer you are on TikTok, the more benevolent view you have of Chinese human rights. They've statistically shown this. So it is working, and there is evidence that it's happening. And there's, and they are more direct. There's something called the United Front, which is kind of like the enforcer of the Chinese Communist Party for information and against its people globally. These people operate in the U.S., like in New York City and places like this, trying to repress Chinese Americans and their political views. That happens day to day. Law enforcement here sees it. And I'm sure they would love to do that directly with, American citizens who are not Chinese American. That's just harder for them to do. So they're definitely trying to do this stuff. The threat is very real.
How do you think they go about doing this when it comes to actually like is it a group of psychologists? I mean, this has to be such a big muscle movement to structure just the plan of how we soften the blow, how we soften the view. Like, hey, does it take 3 months? Do we have a bunch of influencers that create content? Is it AI that's creating content? The messaging and structuring this, coming from your intelligence background, if we're talking about psyops, et cetera, like this seems like a long play, and it's got to have multiple touch points, but it all has to be in sync and follow the game plan in order to execute this. Like how do they actually go about doing that?
Yeah, I think it's like a little less strategic than that, in the sense that They are trying different things out. The Russians were very good at this in like the 2016 election meddling, for example.
Okay.
It's not that they had like a plan. They sort of tried out a bunch of things and they, went with whatever stuck. And China can try to do that. I would look at like maybe a good framework is think about the advertising industry. How do I get you to buy a Chevy instead of a Ford, right? Well, I mean, I can show you information, right? And I can show you a lot of that information. The more you see information, the more you trust it. This is just like human nature. So one way that China can do this is if it controls a network like TikTok, it can show you more of one type of information and less of another. So it can show you by manipulating the algorithm more good things about China, and maybe how the food is good or how the economy is doing great or how their technology is so wondrous, and they can show you less about the bad things like the repressing the Uyghurs as a group and the fact that they put people in a concentration camp. Good luck finding those kinds of stories on it. And so you can now imagine this sort of at scale, and it's happening on TikTok, but there are other places as well. You can look at education technologies. Not a lot of people know this, but Chinese companies own the Princeton Review and Tutor.com, where like thousands and thousands of Americans get educated every day. They can, and I haven't seen yet the statistical studies on that like I have for TikTok, but I think it's likely that at some point they would love to use that in the same way. China has its own AI, and AI, as is kind of becoming the arbiter of information. Like, I don't even search Google anymore. I just ask ChatGPT. Well, with something like DeepSeek, a Chinese AI system, it does censor information. This has been shown. It censors information about Tiananmen Square and other issues. So they can again show you more of one thing, less of another, and do this subtly and over a long period of time. And one more example that maybe we're all even more accustomed to is even in like Hollywood movies, for example. I mean, when's the last time you saw a Chinese person as a bad guy in a Hollywood movie? Probably never, right? And even there's sort of the famous example in Top Gun 2. If you remember in the original Top Gun, Tom Cruise's jacket had a Japanese flag and a Taiwanese flag on it, and then that was censored. Those flags were changed when the previews of the movie came out because Tencent, a Chinese company, was one of the producers on the movie. Now people kind of freaked out, thankfully. And that changed, and by the time the movie came out, that happened. But like those kinds of things are subtle, and over time and over years and generations could lead people to, not see Japan as the ally that it is, for example. I think that would be something that China would love.
Yeah, I did forget about the Top Gun example, but obviously that was a big one of just the subtle manipulation. Not even subtle, right? I mean, subtle to the population, but probably pretty pointed inside those meeting rooms. Pivoting here just a little bit, democratization of super weapons. So like building a nuclear weapon, obviously very challenging. Building a fighter jet, very challenging, requires a lot of technological innovation and capability to do so. Not saying AI doesn't require the same, especially when we're talking about chips and computers and actually the core to make it happen. But it does seem like just like drones have kind of democratized weapons and the ability to do long-range strategic strike. I would categorize Ukraine's attack on Russian bomber bases, right? Like they didn't need a B-2 to do that long-range strike. They were able to do it with some semi-trucks and some drones. Are we entering a period now where AI, computers have kind of democratized the ability for deep strike, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's democratizing a lot, and look at intelligence. So intelligence is becoming democratized. You and I right now could get online and use tools that only a CIA analyst could have used 25 years ago and do intelligence, right? We can access commercial satellite imagery. We can access powerful social network analysis tools, right? We can even access, effectively SIGINT, right? Like mobile movement data from cell phones around the world, right? And perform intelligence ourselves. I think even the same thing could happen with covert action in a sense, where we could go perform our own influence operation if that's what we wanted. We could put out ads and somewhere else in the world. And you're right. It's happening with drones, and that these systems are basically inexpensive. But even for more expensive things, there was an example where people kind of got together online and bought a satellite for Ukraine, because these, it was like a SAR satellite.
Yes.
And, and that satellite was bought by, like, it wasn't from Boeing or Lockheed Martin. It was, it's from a tech company. And that tech company is staffed by, like most tech companies, 30-year-old smart, people out of MIT or wherever, right? Like, this isn't in some classified facility in Virginia or Colorado or something. This is in, a tech startup where people get, catered sushi lunch or whatever. And so, I do think we're entering an era where people can be super empowered in this way.
Interesting. And so with that too, as like this, the entire world appears to be shifting drastically and quickly when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to espionage, like overarching, would you say, now really the focus moving into the future is I need to spy on, I need to hack the model, I need to hack the system that's in place versus not all these ancillary, all these other, I guess, avenues or vectors of attack. It's really kind of moving kind of more directly towards, like, if we're going to win this race, we got to be inside their models. We got to be inside the tech that makes the models work.
We've always, at least since World War II, targeted intelligence at machines, right? We had ELINT, for example, and we would track the telemetry of missiles and, things like that. We would, people can try to, break into any computer system that they can, or tap a line, or spy on, some other signal, for example. But, as intelligence becomes driven by AI, and AI is not just a tool to communicate or to be used by an analyst, but it's actually doing the intelligence, we're absolutely going to target intelligence at those systems. And we're going to do it. They're, in a weird way, they're almost going to become more like people and the way we target people. So we're going to want to see, how does this particular AI system think and analyze the situation? So just like I might, have targeted, maybe Russia and the Soviets would target and try to figure out how our national security advisor would think and make a decision, right, in the past. Maybe I want to know how this AI system is going to think. And then maybe I'll try to take it a step further and see, can I change the way it thinks? Can I effectively kind of sabotage it in such a way? Maybe I can feed it the equivalent of disinformation so that it thinks something different. There's something called machine learning poisoning. Maybe I can feed it enough images of, of aircraft that it messes up the algorithm and it can no longer detect my F-22 or whatever, right? And so it's interesting. I think that the competition with AI is going to become more like it is with espionage on people than it is with espionage on machines were in the past.
I've joked. I think Russia's won the SEO game when it comes to fighter jets, because if you look at the Air Force, it's been printed on walls. If you look at 5K fun run shirts, anything, there'll be a silhouette of a flanker, because undoubtedly, like if you go Google, like F-15, F-15 will show up. But whoever's making the shirts, at their local base, they find it and it's a silhouette of a flanker, and you're just like, Russia just must have their game up when it comes to SEO. So, AI is the next step when if you're able to poison the model. Is China building super soldiers?
Well, I think probably yes. I think they probably are. And, take a step back. There's a company in China called BGI Genomics. They're a global, massive corporation. They've been collecting DNA information from people globally. They do it through COVID tests. They do it through tests for pregnant women on their babies. This has been reported on. Reuters did a great story on this. Washington Post has done stories on this company. It's really scary. That company has contracts with the PLA, with the People's Liberation Army, and who knows who else, likely others, but like publicly it's known that they have contracts with the PLA. And there's in one instance for what's called population improvement, is the nature of that contract. So when again, you kind of have to think like an intelligence officer for a second here, because they're never going to say what they're doing. When I start to put together the pieces and I see, a global collection of DNA information, and I see contracts that say population improvement, and when I know that the competition, and at the same time I see massive investments in genetic engineering and biotechnology, I think it's pretty likely that they're developing some form of human improvement. And there have been studies on this kind of thing, and there was a researcher in China who genetically engineered an unborn baby to be immune to AIDS, and it worked. From what we can tell, that person has disappeared. No one knows what's going on anymore. It was said that he was arrested, but no one knows. And even with think of like the Olympics. Will there be some form of genetic doping at some point where, a person's genes are changed to make them a better athlete? I think that's pretty likely. I mean, we saw that with the Soviets, where they were doping people like crazy in the Olympics during the Cold War. And, there's just a history of this kind of thing that goes on. So, again, adding up all these pieces, very, very possible. And I would say likely that sort of quote unquote super soldiers are being made. And by the way, it might be things like, we picture, because of the movies, like super strong or super fast soldiers. Maybe they just have really, really good cold tolerance, right? China is trying to compete in the Himalayas against India, and they have these outposts there, and it's at a very high altitude. It's very cold. Like, maybe you just have people who have very, very high tolerance for cold. Or maybe you make them really smart, right? And there were some, there's a recent news stories about this in China, which, like a lot of places in the world, they want, people want their children to be smart and good looking and all these things. There's like an economic move to do that. And maybe they create a population of very smart people. They have very different rules when it comes to medical testing and so forth there. And I'll give you one more example of why I think that they know this is likely. This was just in a news story recently, that when Xi came and met with Biden in San Francisco, as Xi left, his kind of handlers came in and wiped down all of the surfaces that he had touched in the room with bleach or something like this, so that he wouldn't leave behind any DNA, right? Like, they clearly believe that this DNA information can be used for something. Maybe it's creating a bioweapon that only targeted him, for example. Like, who knows? But they're definitely paranoid. So they're definitely starting to think this way.
The bioweapon piece would be the flip side that I would think about if you're able to manipulate. You see something that, you could manipulate for a certain population to target it without impacting other ones, would be the flip side of that. So when it comes to guardrails, right? Like if they don't have as many limitations when it comes to testing this on humans, the same could also be said probably for AI, where I mean, and again, like, we're worried about climate change and global warming. I would say that the Chinese are probably less concerned with that, right? That they have an objective to be the world's superpower, and they're going to get there any way they see fit. So with AI, do you think too do we have handcuffs on ourselves that will limit our ability to win, or at the level it needs to be, that's not really a factor?
Well, pros and cons for their side. They can be much more directed, right? And they can just decide, the government can just decide we're going to pump billions of dollars into something. The downside is that they may choose the wrong thing to focus on. On our side, it's kind of the opposite, right? Like, it's very hard for our government to decide to do something and then put like real money into it. But at the same time, it's this open system, and we just try. The only thing that matters is whether it works. And so it's a very efficient way to make investments, especially in something like AI. So China, for example, could go, hard and fast into machine learning or into LLMs or into some other form of AI. But what often happens in AI is that works great for 6 months or a year or 2 years or 3 years, but eventually it stops working. You've got to move on to the next thing, and you've got to do it quickly. And that's what our system is great at. And so I think as long as we continue to maintain that kind of system, we're going to stay ahead in any technology like AI that moves that quickly. The other thing that works against them is, you're right. We could be in danger of regulation, and we do that. And it's interesting to watch the debate play out right now about the Trump administration saying they don't want to regulate AI in any way, and some states saying they do want to regulate it. And that's like a debate we have in America all the time about any technology or industry. In China, they're worried about really different things, right? And in AI in particular, they are very worried that AI could be used to harm in some way the party. That's the only thing they care about, really, is whether the party could be harmed or endangered. And so they actually are regulating AI a lot, right? Like, any AI system in China has to be trained in such a way as that it won't speak against the party, for example. So that's a huge regulatory burden that likely, really slows them down, because how can you have this super intelligent system that's like essentially being censored? Like, it's never going to be that intelligent then. So, pros and cons on either side, but I would choose our side, any day when I add it up.
As we move along, do you think AI gets to a point where it exceeds our ability to process, maintain, control as a human being, as a commander, as a decision maker, et cetera?
Definitely at the tactical level, I think AI could get very good at making tactical decisions, maybe even operational decisions. Strategically, it's not quite there. I think to be, good at the level of strategy or at geopolitics, you essentially would need to be a human. You'd need AGI, right? This like artificial general intelligence, and we're not quite there yet, because when you start to think about strategy and geopolitics and things like this and grand strategy, it takes into account everything. It's not just about one subject, it's everything. Like, the art that another society likes might matter, right? That was a form of competition during the Cold War. The CIA backed the Paris Review and like modernist artists, right? Like, would an AI connect those two? It's unclear that it could think that broadly. But I will say this in people's favor, if you can think about it like that. People are always going to lead people. There could be an AI and it could be super intelligent, but at the end of the day, if you're a person and you're in a dangerous situation, you're going to look at another person who's in the same situation as you, who thinks like you and has gained your, respect in some way, right? And that's always going to be the case. That's just how our minds work, our brains work. And so I think there's always going to be a place for leaders, for politicians, you know, for officers and NCOs who like lead people, you know, downrange. There's always going to be a place for that, no matter how good the AI gets.
Thanks. All right, as we wrap up here, what haven't I asked you that I should be asking you? What have I missed here? I know we're probably just scratching the surface, but what is it that I'm missing?
Well, it can seem like a little depressing, right? That AI is going to do all this stuff, and these competitions are going to be about, you know, drones and all these things. And so, you know, one thing I would say is that there's, you know, continuing that last point, there's always going to be a place for people. That job might change a lot. Maybe you're not doing intelligence analysis in the traditional way. You're not reading a lot of reports and writing a report, but you're still doing something key. You're going out and you are, you know, being the partner with the consumer of intelligence, the way the PDB briefer is with the president. Maybe you're doing that. Maybe not always with the president, but other people. You're that partner out there, answering questions, thinking through what needs to be done, you know, being a thought partner with someone, say, operationally in a battlefield or strategically when we're trying to make a decision. So there's always going to be a role for people. I think it's just going to change a lot. And so, you know, I think for younger people sort of thinking about, do I get a career in this? Like, should I go do this? Should I join the Air Force or the Navy or, you know, the CIA or go serve my country? I think there's absolutely going to be a role. I think it's going to be really different than what you read about. You know, if you read a Tom Clancy novel or something and you know, imagine, you know, what Jack Ryan did, it's probably going to be a very different job than that, but it's going to be no less interesting and important. And I think we still need people to do that. And by the way, your skill set might look totally different. You know, maybe like I studied international relations, you know, before I joined intelligence, but maybe you're studying technology, you're doing computer science, or you're doing business. Like, you know, economic intelligence is going to be really important. You know, maybe you get an MBA, not a PhD, right? Like the job of an intelligence officer and the background of an intelligence officer might be very different, but there's still going to be a role. It's still important to sign up. And I think it's a really rewarding career. And, you know, if there's anybody listening who wants to do it, I think you should absolutely still go out and do it.
Dr. Vinci, thanks for joining me on the podcast today. Your book, The Fourth Intelligence Revolution, The Future of Espionage and the Battle to Save America, is out there. And I'll link everything down below. Again, been a fascinating conversation today, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Everyone.